the Resident Evil games have been patched with ray tracing support for current-gen consoles and PCs, but the patches are rather hit or miss. In today's video on DF, I will talk about some of the positives of the new ray tracing patch in Resident Evil 2 on PC, but I'll spend most of the time in this video actually using this opportunity to talk about issues in Capcom's PC games as of late, as their PC efforts leave a lot to be desired, to be honest. To cut to the chase, not everything is an improvement in the new version here, hence why shortly after release, Capcom made that original non-updated DX11 version of the game available as a download as a Steam beta branch. This is a positive move in response to community outcry, but it also shows quite irrefutably that Capcom's update here is so poor that they have to admit it themselves and allow the old version to be downloaded. That really shouldn't be necessary if they did the update right. But before I get into the myriad of issues, let me talk about the few positive aspects of this update in RE2. As my colleague Oliver talked about in his video covering the consoles, ray tracing is a big quality win here versus the game's native screen space reflections, which were frankly always terrible, and something I even complained about back in my original videos on this game. On top of this, there is the addition of RTGI, replacing SSAO, which indeed enhances the visuals with some better ambient shadowing on average, and even some local light bounce on top of the static GI pass for dynamic stuff. While the RT in general is positive, it is the same RT we saw in Resident Evil Village, which is incredibly low resolution and low quality on average, as it seems to have been made with consoles in mind. Even at 4K, the reflections seem to be around 1080p internally, and they look nearest neighbor upscaled up to that 4K, so they're really blocky. And sadly, there's no real in-game setting above high to alleviate this issue, but more on that at the end of the video. Beyond that, there's another semi-hidden upgrade with the interlacing or checkerboarding option that consoles use. As you can see here with the reflection on the ground, in the various game versions, the console versions of RE Engine games almost all universally use this interlacing image reconstruction. One of its telltale signs is its effect on ray-traced reflections, leaving them even more pixelated looking. But beyond that artifact, interlacing is actually pretty great. The issue is that the original PC release you see on the left here had interlacing being completely busted. The new implementation of that is on the right, and you can see it's working correctly, much like it does on console. So if you want to utilize this game's image reconstruction to increase performance, interlacing is now a viable option if you're interested. And that's honestly really about it. The only really worthwhile aspect of this patch is that ray tracing. Beyond ray tracing, this update is indeed a downgrade of the game. First, there's performance. Let's exclude ray tracing here to keep things at par, as it's crucial to mention how significantly slower this game is after the update versus how it was before, and I'll demonstrate that on a GTX 1060. Check this out. Back at release in 2019, I actually recommended targeting 1440p with this GPU and using my optimized settings, as I thought it offered a surprisingly compelling 60 FPS experience. With the new version of the game utilizing DX12, which is the only API on offer there in the new version, the game is now on average 25 to 30% slower in terms of average FPS. In a number of scenes, that can mean the difference between the GTX 1060 being healthily above 60 FPS in the old version versus it being below 60 FPS in the new version. It can mean the difference between just at 60 FPS in the old version to being barely 40 FPS in the new version. And a reminder, the only difference here on the GTX 1060 is the game version and API used. DX11 on the left, DX12 on the right. All the other graphical settings have otherwise been equalized, barring some strange artistic color differences in the version. Other than that, the game is the exact same. I find this a shockingly bad turn of events, and it is kind of a damning indictment of Capcom's DX12 implementation. You're looking at GPU limited footage here, and that is basically showing that Capcom's DX12 version is massively underutilizing GPU resources in comparison to driver-directed DX11. This issue affects all GPUs, even massive ones. So seriously, if you're at all interested in raw performance and not interested in ray tracing, then use the older DX11 version of the game. On top of running worse by default, the older version of the game will also technically offer a better graphical experience if you're not using ray tracing. For example, in the old version, you could use HBO Plus to get rid of haloing provided by the game's default SSAO. In the new version of the game, you're just stuck with that inferior SSAO in the menu. Similarly, in the new version, the super sampling slider does not work, and the game runs and looks the same no matter what the super sampling is set to. Also in the new version,